Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, November 3rd, where I wanted to talk a little bit about A Midsummer Night's Dream and also remind you that registration is now open. You've probably seen some of the signs across campus, so you should be meeting with your advisor. If you don't know who your advisor is, you can look that up on my GCC. You can also go to the Advising Center as well. And you can find the link for registration on our webpage. And you should be able to find classes not just for the spring semester, but also for the intersession, which is a very condensed kind of format that meets in the January where we would normally have our winter break. In 3.5 weeks, you can complete an entire semester. It's quite intense. So you meet every day if you meet in person for 3 or 4 hours a day, or the equivalent if you were meeting online. But again, the good news is that at the ending of 3.5 weeks, you would have completed a 3 or 4 credit class. And usually the classes are smaller and the students are pretty serious. They would have to be in terms of being able to accommodate that kind of a schedule. So you won't have as many options as you would have during a spring semester, but you still will have some options in intersession. I myself teach a public speaking class during intersession, and I think that discipline lends itself quite nicely to the intersession format because there is so much audience or student participation involved with giving speeches. Most of you will probably need to take another 200 level English class or a 200 level English class now that you are taking an English 112, which is Introduction to Literature. So a 200 level English class would be specializing in a particular area of literature. It could be an author, it could be a time period. If you're interested in Shakespeare, since we're talking about Shakespeare, I will be teaching the 200 level class in Shakespeare next semester. I'll be teaching it online, and we will be beginning with A Midsummer Night's Dream. So that puts you a little bit ahead if you decided to take that class. And if you're curious as to where you could find my horror film class, it would not be under English. It would be under CMN for communications. So if you have any questions at all about the schedule or about registration, just let me know. If you are really interested in English classes and you were to take 6 200 level English classes, basically most of the electives in your liberal arts general degree, you could graduate with a concentration in English. And I happen to be the advisor for that as well, though you could speak to anybody in the English department about it. So as you know, we've been watching a performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and ideally we would have been watching a performance from Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, the reconstructed Globe, but I have not been able to get access to a streaming video of that. So instead we saw the BBC version of A Midsummer Night's Dream. The advantage to the BBC version is that it's the closest version you will get to the actual text itself. So that's a positive. Though, of course, the BBC versions were done in the 1980s, so they're somewhat dated. But regardless of what version you see with The Midsummer Night's Dream, I think you can see that the tone of the play is very celebratory because we think that comedies were performed either immediately before or after wedding ceremonies. And the plot is quite complex, deliberately so, because the theme is about love and all of the complications associated with love. So the plot reinforces the idea of the complexity associated with love. And if you'll note in the notes below, I've indicated the major elements of the plot because I'm aware that this is not necessarily an introduction to Shakespeare class. It's an introduction to literature class. And unlike Oedipus the King, where we had one major plot, we will have multiple subplots, but they will all connect with one another and they will all be related to love. And the first, there's my telephone, sorry about that. The first is about Theseus and Hippolyta. And they are an engaged couple and they are going to be married, but their union is one that is quite telling because it ultimately is about being conquered in war, which was a very typical kind of love at the time, where love was a political union or a social union. It wasn't very much a romantic union. So Theseus and Hippolyta, they're engaged couple, and they represent one stage of love. We have Hermia and Lysander, we're supposed to be younger, and they're a dating couple. So that's an earlier stage of love. And Hermia defies her father. Her father wants her to be with someone else, and she dares to say no. And at the time of the Renaissance, a daughter would be viewed as a father's property and then eventually as a husband's property. So the idea that we've got a strong female who's willing to say no shows how rather progressive Shakespeare would be at the time period, especially because by the ending of the play, she gets exactly what it is that she wants. But don't expect simple answers from Shakespeare. So if you're looking for a clear-cut theme about the power of female, that will be undercut with some of the other female characters. So again, we see complexity. But nevertheless, Lysander and Hermia represent the dating stage of love. Now, Helena and Demetrius represent fickle love because Demetrius had once pledged his love to Helena prior to the play, but he's changed his mind. And not only is he no longer in love, but he's in love with Hermia, which is particularly problematic because that's Helena's best friend. And also, of course, Hermia is in love with someone else. Now, Demetrius is the individual that Hermia's father, Aegeus, would like Hermia to pursue. He doesn't necessarily give a good reason, and I think that's important. Both of these men, Lysander and Demetrius, are rather similar to one another, and deliberately so, to show how interchangeable lovers can be in the love relationship. We see how fickle love is when Demetrius had once loved Helena, but now no longer does. And we see how irrational love can be because, again, Aegeus has no particularly good reason for wanting his daughter to be with one man over another, outside of the fact that it's his will. In other words, the issue of power and who has it and who doesn't is a major theme throughout the play. And then we've got Fairy Oberon. Oh, actually, we've got Demetrius and Hermia, who represent unrequited love, because while Demetrius is in love with Hermia, Hermia is not in love with Demetrius. Note that Hermia and Helena have names that are very similar to one another. That's very deliberate. They both start with H's, again, so that we can confuse them easily with one another. Though they have very different physical appearances, this is important that Hermia is the short brunette and Helena is the tall blonde. According to the conceptions of beauty at the time, the tall blonde should be the one getting all of the attention. That's not the way this play begins. Instead, we have Hermia, the short brunette, who's getting all of the attention. Again, some of the ways that Shakespeare questions the conceptions of his time. And then we have Fairy Oberon and Queen Titania. They are a married couple, and they represent yet another stage of love. They are arguing, and they happen to be arguing over a changeling child. And there is some fairy folklore that is associated in this play, though Shakespeare would have changed some of the fairy folklore to suit his purposes. A changeling was a child that would have been stolen in the middle of the night by fairies and would have been replaced with someone from the fairy kingdom. So Shakespeare took that idea and used it for Hermia, or used it for Titania, I should say. And the idea is that one of Titania's serving women died in childbirth, and therefore Titania feels compelled to raise that boy. So we don't necessarily get the fairy folklore of a transfer or a mixing of one or another child. But what we do get is this sense of a power play between Oberon and Titania. Again, Titania should be listening to her husband's will because, in effect, she would be seen as his property, but she dares to defy him. In fact, she even forswears his marriage bed, which means that she's denying him sexual relations at that point. And then we're introduced to Bottom and his cohorts. They are laborers. They are at the bottom of the social scale, so Bottom is aptly named. Bottom also acts like an ass, a bottom, so he's aptly named that way. They are rehearsing a play about, well, love. Pyramus and Thisbe. This is very common for Shakespeare to insert a play within a play, very meta, to give a kind of commentary on what we've just witnessed. So we know at the very beginning of the play that we have King Theseus, who's appealed to, who orders Hermia to follow her father and his will, or else she faces a nunnery or death. Aegeus, Hermia's father, in desperation, goes to the highest law of the land, King Theseus, to ask that Theseus make his daughter listen to his will. Now, of course, this is going to be necessary somewhat for plot because we need some time to elapse. She needs some time to be able to consider what her options are so she can make the decision to run away with her lover into the woods. Again, a very common trope when you have two young lovers in love and the family doesn't necessarily approve, so they run away. And this is also a plot device from Shakespeare to get all of these characters out of Athens, which is the beginning of the play, and Athens represents civilization and order, and to get them into the woods, which represents wildness, things that are wild and untamed. We saw that a little bit with short stories such as Young Goodman Brown. So, they decide, ultimately, Hermia and Lysander, that they are going to run away into the woods, and then for some reason, Helena decides to tell Demetrius what Hermia and Lysander are going to be doing. And according to Helena, she's doing it because she's hopeful that Demetrius will feel a certain indebtedness to her and then will pay attention to her. It's irrational. And this is one of the statements about love that Shakespeare is making in the play, that love is oftentimes irrational and can interfere with our thinking. Of course, Hermia and Helena are best friends, or at least they are until Act 3. So Hermia confides to Helena, and then Helena tries to use that to her advantage by telling Demetrius that he, in theory, no longer has any hope because his love, Hermia, has run away. Instead, what he's going to do is chase after Hermia, of course. That'll get him into the wilderness or the forest. And, of course, Helena will chase after him. So that will get her into the wilderness or the forest. And then we, of course, have Bottom and his cohorts, and they decide to rehearse in the woods because they don't want to be, they don't want anyone to interfere with their particular performance. So they focus on the idea of practicing in the woods, which means that this is an opportunity to get all of our subplots in one place, out of Athens and into the woods. So now Fairy Oberon, who again has been arguing with his wife, he happens to have a, quote, servant, unquote, Fairy Puck, also known as Robin Goodfellow. This is also part of fairy folklore. Puck, or Robin Goodfellow, is known as a mischievous fairy, one that isn't evil but that enjoys playing pranks. And I put the idea of Puck being a servant because the idea of Puck following orders is somewhat laughable because Puck basically does whatever it is Puck wants to do. And of course, this sense of Oberon being in control is also something that we can question because without Puck, I don't know how much influence Oberon would have over the fairy world. But nevertheless, Oberon has a scheme that he presents to Puck that he wants Puck to put this magical juice on Fairy Titania's, Queen Titania's eyes, so that when she awakes, she falls in love with the first thing that she sees. This will distract her so that ultimately Oberon can steal that changeling boy. Again, this is a power dynamic between the two of them. And this is also another commentary on love, that when we are in love, we tend to no longer care about the things that we used to have concerns about, such as fairy boys, for instance. We become distracted by other things, such as love. And we also become quite blind when we're in love. And this will be important as the play progresses. Now, of course, one of the things that happens is that Oberon decides that he wants to assist Helena because he has overheard her conversations with Demetrius, and that Demetrius is no longer in love with her. This is necessary as a plot device to forward the plot forward, though we could say that perhaps Oberon feels a bit of empathy because ultimately he has his own love problems as well, so perhaps he can understand. Now, Puck on his own, because Puck doesn't always follow orders, decides to turn Bottom, remember Bottom and his cohorts are rehearsing the play within a play, into an ass. This is very appropriate because Bottom has been acting like an ass, and of course this will be important for the plot later on. Now, Fairy Titania, when she awakes after having the love juice in her eyes, the first thing she sees is Bottom, the ass. And that means she falls in love with the figurative and literal ass, or the rhetorical question that I usually ask. How many of us have ever fallen in love with an ass? The idea is that this is a timeless and universal theme, and that when we are in love, we are blind, and we lose our ability to have reason and rationality, as we see with Titania. And then, in theory, Puck mistakenly puts the love juice on Lysander's eyes instead of Demetrius's eyes. Now, the instructions Puck received were quite general and could be misinterpreted, because basically Puck was told by Fairy Oberon to put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb. In theory, we could say there are two men wearing Athenian garb. One is Lysander and one is Demetrius. So much of this will depend on how the actor wants to present the role, based on the director's directing. It could seem that Puck is being more deliberate when he does this because he likes to create discord. So he deliberately puts the love juice on the wrong man's eyes, knowing that he could defend his actions by saying, well, you weren't explicit. Or it could be an honest mistake, but the reality is that once the mistake is made, Puck takes great delight in the confusion that occurs afterwards. So in trying to fix this, the love juice is then placed on Demetrius's eyes. The problem is that it's never removed from Lysander's eyes. So that means now we have two men, Lysander and Demetrius, who are in love with Helena, which is the exact opposite way we began the play when we had two men, Lysander and Demetrius, in love with Hermia, which gets us close to the third act. I had talked about a Shakespearean play being much like a pyramid structure. Act 1 to introduce the characters, Act 2 the beginning of tension, Act 3 the height of tension. And this is where what I call the catfight scene occurs in Act 3, when all of the lovers begin arguing with one another and even come to blows. And if this were a tragedy, they would kill each other. But of course, everyone is confused, particularly Hermia, because she was the center of everyone's attention, and now she's the center of no one's attention. And Helena, because no one had wanted her at the beginning of the play, and now everybody wants her. So Helena is convinced that this is just some sort of horrible joke that's being played against her. And this leads to an argument between her and Hermia, who were former best friends, which goes to show what love can do to friendships. It can destroy them. And of course, the men get involved. And this could turn tragic, but we know that this is a comedy, so that it needs to end happily ever after. So basically, Puck is going to intervene, and that means that the love juice is going to be removed from Lysander's eyes, so that ultimately he returns to loving Hermia. But the love juice will remain on Demetrius' eyes, so that he will remain loving Helena. And this is the way that the play began. This is supposed to be a happy ending. I don't know how happy I would be if I were Demetrius, because I was manipulated into love. The love juice is also taken from Titania's eyes, so that she's no longer humiliated. At this point, we have Oberon, who basically has taken the changeling child. So he's won, so to speak. And this is where I think things get a bit problematic about the portrayal of female. Hermia is a strong woman who defies her father, and basically she gets what she wants at the ending of the play. Titania is a strong woman who defies her husband, but does not get what she wants by the ending of the play. And Helena is complicated. In some ways, we could see her as quite passive and weak, as she is chasing after somebody who doesn't want her. Or we can see her as rather strong because, as she says, women were not made to woo, and yet she takes the role of the active pursuer, and she gets exactly what it is that she wants. The donkey spell has to be removed from Bottom at this particular point so that he returns to human form, but he's still acting like an ass, and he always will. And then King Theseus intervenes and declares that since the human couples are happy, he's not going to be making any kind of judgment. So basically, everyone is content except for Hermia's father, who has to accept the will. And it would seem that at this point, the play is over, even though we're only in Act 4. Act 5 happens to be Bottom and his cohorts, putting on the play within a play. And again, nothing is accidental in Shakespeare. That play within a play reflects back on some of the major themes of what we've just witnessed in the first 4 acts. It's a ridiculous play, Pyramus and Thisbe, because it's being performed and was written by ridiculous people, Bottom and his cohorts. It almost reminds me of an elementary school production where everything is taken so literally, with poor acting and poor writing. And oftentimes it's read as a commentary on Shakespeare's competition that they engage in poor acting and poor writing, which I'll talk a little bit about more next class. There's a lot of humor and bawdiness in this. It's about love that's gone bad. It's a tragedy, but it's what A Midsummer Night's Dream could have been if we didn't have intervention so that we could have a happy ending. And the plot is somewhat similar to Romeo and Juliet, about, two young lovers that basically experience tragedy. But it's incredibly humorous because it's performed in such an absurd and ridiculous way. And the characters of the play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, are watching this performance, and of course they're enjoying it because it's so absurd, and they're laughing at it. But never once do they stop to consider that they themselves were equally absurd just hours earlier when they were involved in their own love relationships. So they really don't have any insight into what they've just experienced. And the true twist is for us as audience, that if we're laughing at Pyramus and Thisbe and we never once consider that we ourselves could be equally absurd in love as we saw throughout the entire play of A Midsummer Night's Dream, then we've lost the lesson as well. And then what is probably one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches, this happens to be Puck's final speech, where Puck says farewell to the audience, and he also asks for applause. In this instance, Puck is oftentimes seen as a kind of Shakespeare figure, giving a sort of a backhanded apology that really isn't an apology at all, because Puck says, if I were an honest Puck, and trust me, Puck is anything but honest. And the sense that we shouldn't take things too literally, because after all, this was just a dream, which gets us to our title, A Midsummer Night's Dream. The idea that love is like a dream. It's something that's uncontrollable. It's something that can be nightmarish, but something that can also be quite pleasant. And think about even some of the terms we use with love. We tend to fall in love, and all of the negative connotations associated with falling, not being in control, hurting oneself, perhaps even killing oneself. All of that is embedded in this comedic play, so there can be some darkness in this play as well. And certainly Oberon comes off as a rather dark character. He's quite mean-spirited to his bride, Titania, when he humiliates her. And again, it depends on the performance that you're watching to see how mean-spirited he might happen to be. You'll see that in the notes below, I've got additional commentary that I'm going to be following up on. In addition to the title and thinking about night and all of the associations with night, darkness and mystery, and all of the associations with dreams, that love is like a dream. Midsummer, and Midsummer was a pagan holiday. It's about the summer solstice, and it happens to be the longest day of the year. And also it was a day that was associated with fertility. And this is interesting that a play that emphasizes so much the importance of female virginity until marriage is ultimately set in one of the most sexually promiscuous days of the year. The way fertility was celebrated was through sexual union and pagan days. So we'll talk about that. You might have heard of the Maypole. May Day is referenced in this play, as well as Midsummer. And the Maypole for May Day is also a phallic symbol. It's supposed to represent the phallus. So I don't know if elementary school children understand what they're doing when they dance around the maypole, but this is a pagan celebration of fertility as well. So references to May Day and Midsummer sets this play deliberately in a very erotic time, even though it's so important that Helena and Hermia remain virginal until marriage. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well next class. But if a woman did not remain virginal until marriage, she was seen as basically damaged goods. So we'll talk some more about some of these elements, as well as some important quotation from the play as well. But I wanted to make sure that you had a sense of understanding of what was going on with the plot, and then we can talk a little bit more about themes and talk a little bit more about specific language. You might have noticed when you were watching the production, if you listen carefully, you can hear the rhythms of the speech. They're almost like heartbeats. Ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. Iambic pentameter, a 10-syllable line. And also, there was a good amount of rhyme in this play, and rhyme is supposed to represent the higher orders, and prose or complete sentences, the lower orders. But Shakespeare would sometimes mix that up to make a commentary about a character either descending, somebody who started at a higher level in speaking poetry and ultimately experienced descent and spoke incomplete sentences, or vice versa. Somebody from a lower level, a laborer, let's say, who was speaking complete sentences, who then could ascend and could ultimately speak in poetry, which was a rather subversive idea at the time, that one wasn't necessarily born into a particular position, which was the idea behind the Renaissance. It was called the chain of being, and that everything had status and hierarchy in society. You were born into a position, you stayed there. Shakespeare would oftentimes show how a character could move up or down that chain of being based on their reason and their intellect and their behavior, and would do so through the use of language, whether a character was speaking in complete sentences, prose, or speaking in poetry, verse. So that's one of the many ways that Shakespeare made subversive statements about politics during the time. As well as all of these levels of love relationships represent different levels in society, whether we've got the lowest level being the laborer, this would be bottom. We've got the highest level, which would be considered the fairy kingdom, because the fairies would be higher than, let's say, humanity, where we've got the nobility, like Hermia and Lysander and Demetrius and Helena. But regardless of what station you're at in society, everyone acts equally ridiculous in love. Even King Theseus and Queen Hippolyta. And the king and queen would be seen as basically the highest level of the chain of being on earth. They would basically be God's mouthpiece. Though, of course, if there's a fairy kingdom, they would be considered higher than humans because of their abilities that go beyond the human realm. So that gives you a little bit of an idea, again, of what it is that we are talking about when we talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream. And next class, what I'll do is I'll put some closure onto the play by talking about some themes and some language. So what's left, basically, is the attendance question for today. And that will be due on Saturday at noon at 12 o'clock. And the attendance question is, what did you find to be the most surprising about A Midsummer Night's Dream? What did you find to be the most surprising about the play A Midsummer Night's Dream? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. And also we will continue talking about drama as a whole. Take care. Bye-bye.